Welcome to English Express. No glamour, no clamor, simple explanation for last moment revision. Today we are discussing Chapter 11 of To Kill a Mockingbird. This chapter focuses on the episode dedicated to Mrs. Du Bois, a short-tempered old lady who lived alone in the neighborhood, along with a Negro girl, a maid. She was very old. She spent most of each day in bed and the rest of it in a wheelchair. This is how Mrs. Du Bois is actually described, which highlights that old age brings in a lot of concepts and ideas which young people or young minds would be a little jittery to think or probe into. Old age makes you incapable. Old age makes you lonely and neglected. And it definitely affects your temperament, making you cranky as well. Mrs. Du Bois was a victim of a cranky nature, and we learn that Mrs. Du Bois was cantankerous old lady who would always yell at Jem and Scout as they would pass by. The term cantankerous would imply that she was very rough and rude because probably her old age made her aloof and sedentary. She couldn't mingle with people much and she didn't have company. That could probably or perhaps be one of the reasons that she was of a very cranky nature. In fact, when once she even happened to interact with Jem and Scout, she even told them that Atticus is not any better than the people he advocates for. This actually makes Jem very angry. Although Atticus, on the contrary, we note is very calm and very respectful towards Mrs. Du Bois. And every time he would see her, he would always greet her and say that, "Mrs. Du Bois, you look like a picture this evening." And in this manner, he would greet Mrs. Du Bois every time he met her. The children would not understand why was Atticus too soft towards a cranky person like Mrs. Du Bois. Atticus was explained that he was always of the opinion that the kids need to be kind to Mrs. Du Bois as she was old and sick. As we proceed with the chapter, we realize that Jem, who got very annoyed at what Mrs. Du Bois had said regarding his father, that he was advocating for the people, for the blacks, and that is something that that was derogatory, which shows the racist mentality which Mrs. Du Bois had. And as a consequence, Jem, in a fit of rage, takes a baton from Scout and ruins all of Mrs. Du Bois' camellia bushes. As a chastisement, Jem was asked to go to Mrs. Du Bois' house and read to her for a month. Scout also trots along. Together they endure Mrs. Du Bois' abuse and uncanny fits, which was a recurrent phenomenon at the end of every reading session. And each reading session became more prolonged and elaborate than the previous one. Soon, the long punishment of 1 month of Jem going and reading to the old lady comes to an end. Mrs. Du Bois dies a little more than a month after Jem's punishment came to an end. Atticus makes a revelation that Mrs. Du Bois was a morphine addict, and reading to her helped her to stay away from that addiction. Atticus gives Jem a box which Mrs. Du Bois had given to her maid to give to Jem. When Jem opens the box, he finds a single white camellia. A camellia inside that box is something which draws Jem's curiosity. but he's not able to gauge or look into the depth of the idea. Jem is still very immature to realize a lot of things. Mrs. Du Bois giving him that one camellia could imply the distillation or cleansing of her soul, the purging and purity of her soul, which was beyond the racist mentality. Her ability to see goodness and become more transparent as an individual. It was also meant to appreciate Jem for how he had given her that peace and solace by giving her company on a regular basis. If we look closely into the character of Mrs. Du Bois, she lacked company, and Jem and Scout made her feel loved and cared for. Elaborate reading sessions highlights the fact that she wanted the children to stay, although not too expressive, but she loved their company, which she couldn't express in words but in gestures by leaving that one camellia for Jem. Jem, who was still immature to realize the good and bad, can that good and bad actually can be present in the same person, initially refused the gift and therefore failed to see the goodness in Mrs. Du Bois. As we proceed with chapter 11 coming to an end, and as we move into chapter 12, we realize Jem slowly maturing and becoming more retrospective, thought-provoking, like Atticus, and that is where realization and reality hits Jem hard, and he begins to ponder things in depth and with maturity. But prior to this, Jem is still a kid. This was the end of chapter 11. The closeness of Mrs. Du Bois and the kids, and even the differences that we see in the three characters, and Atticus's response and reaction to the same gives us a different view of all the characters in Macomb County. We realize that each character has an individual mind and a way of dealing or looking at situations. Perspective matters. That brings us to the end of chapter 11. More next time as we proceed with the text. For more content, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel.